So the use of a metaphor or literature, art for communicating social information, how we should behave, how we should judge other people's behavior. It's not a binary right wrong thing. Like in the video of the man and son talking about the Paris terror attacks and using flowers. We have flowers instead of guns. That's what's so amazing about that video. The child is like, flowers are nothing. Like when his dad first says that, the kid is so right. He's so smart. He's like, flowers are nothing. How are they going to stop us from guns? That's exactly right. We can't have that kind of empirical certainty. It has to do with a subjective judgment about how that metaphor is applied, how that leap of faith um, is demonstrated in actual life. You know, and this is behind the idea of a jury of your peers, that we can't just objectively, um, empirically evaluate each other's behavior, but that it involves a kind of subjective judgment. And convincing each other to share such leaps of faith. So this is a world leading neuroscientists saying what the brain's about is it's certainly about understanding causal patterns, reductive science, but that's not what human meaning is about. That's not what human history is about. Just want to suggest he ends by saying that the brains are correlated with social complexity. The more social complexity, the bigger the brain. And that's what literature is for, is understanding social complexity. And so I just want you to understand that that's a different thing from, epidemiology or sociology, where we're just trying to break things down into empirical knowledge and probabilities and stuff. So let's listen to this. I think you'll find it helpful.
If you don't mind me
Please.
going first, asking you, Robert, why do we have brains?
Why do we have brains? Probably to more effectively strategize at how to cheat at social contracts. I mean, single cell bacteria do all sorts of cooperative things and honest things and dishonest things when they can get away with it, but they can't do it extremely well. I suspect the nervous system not only makes you a whole lot more responsive to changes in environment, but certainly makes for a lot more complexity in your social interactions.
So the brain is biologically and evolutionarily necessary in order to manage the life that is complicated, or does it help create that complicated life?
Yes, both, and immediately self-reinforcing in terms of the sort of by the time you get to the point of brains inventing things like culture, then you've got brain culture coevolution and each affecting the other, but it certainly gives one a whole lot more flexibility in one's behavior than you find in brainless single cell organisms.
So how do you compare the human brain with brains of primates, non-human primates that you have studied? What makes human brain so singular and stand out?
Well, at the end of the day, it may not be so singular, it may not stand out all that much. When you look for actual regions or cell types in the brain that are unique to humans, just not there. There's fusiform face recognition area, which was once thought to be only in humans. It's in other primates, a bunch of other species. There's these things called von Economo neurons, which for a while appeared to be the only neuron type specific to human. Now it's in elephants, it's in whales, it's in other primates. So the thing that makes the human brain sure is not that we've invented anything new. I mean, we use the exact same neurotransmitter biosynthetic pathways as a shrimp does or something. The big difference is numbers. It's just like our neurons do the exact same thing as a fruit fly's, and you put them under a microscope and they look the same and they smell the same and they taste the same, or who knows what. And the only difference is that we have 100 million for every one that a fruit fly does. And I think the thing that makes human brains what they are is just sheer number of component parts and emergent properties that come from that.
So can you expand on it? Why do we have enlarged brains compared to other animals?
Well, I mean, one thing, but that immediately gets into which came first sort of thing, is we're pretty pitiful compared to an awful lot of other species when it comes to surviving in terms of physical strength, things of that sort. So there was a lot of pressure on brains. But what's clear when you look across all the primate species, selection for brain expansion has not been because predators get smarter or prey get tougher to find, or it's for social complexity. Remarkable finding, a guy named Ian Dunbar at Oxford has shown across about 150 primate species, the single best predictor of the relative size of the cortex and of the frontal cortex is how big the average social group is in that species. In other words, our brains have evolved for gossip and backstabbing and hierarchy and keeping track of who's messing around with who, and it's been enormous evolutionary pressure for just mastering social complexity.
We were talking about attunement, leaps of faith, and it's a serious question. When Kierkegaard talks about leaps of faith, and this is informing why Zadie Smith is talking about Kierkegaard, and what it means, again, to belong to a community. Kierkegaard means this in a radically incomprehensible way. There's no rational, objective, empirical way to measure faith, and that's scary. Because the thing is, people claim to be Abraham all the time, and threaten to or actually murder their children, or to do outlandish things in the name of God. So this is, and Kierkegaard saying there's nothing we can do about that. That's putting it too strong. There's nothing we can empirically know to distinguish the genuine faith from pretended faith. This kind of knowledge does not apply to human history, does not apply to human meanings, human social life. This kind of knowledge is very good for medicine. It's very good for deciding whether to prescribe a vaccine. If it works in 999 out of 1,000 cases, it's a good treatment policy to pursue, but we cannot negotiate human meanings in this manner. Human meanings are much more fine-grained. They have to do with idiosyncratic circumstances. Each life is a series of accidents. We have no way of knowing our individual life. Are we the one, or are we the 999? So human meaning, the way in which we judge human behavior, relies more on that intuitive, childlike kind of judgment, attentiveness to the particular accidental circumstances of situations. And so we have to rely on literature. We have to rely on these more fine-grained examinations of particular idiosyncratic circumstances that are not 100% applicable. The novel can be extremely informative, but you're going to have to apply it metaphorically and as an analogy to your life, which is going to be irreducibly idiosyncratic, as every other life is going to be. You can't figure out your life just by applying objective knowledge. It's a funny way to put it to say the brain evolved to gossip, for backstabbing, you know, chatting about who's sleeping with who. And I think that's a reductive and a little bit facetious way to put it. We only care about backstabbing or gossiping because we care about being good people. We point gossiping matters, and I think a lot of novels are just it's a kind of gossiping about imaginary people. Gossiping about other people's lives, picking apart their hypocrisy matters because we care about being good people. Like that's the only reason it matters. So that's, I think, the other side of the story, and that's what a lot of art is critical of hypocrisy. But it's also about aspiring. One way of thinking about that, it's a difference between a fixed meaning and an ongoing open-ended negotiation, communication. So mutual recognition is never ended. Keeping open this perpetual conversation of about what it means, what human passion means. The activity of reading human passion is transmitted over time. This is a book written by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. It's called Perpetual Peace in English, but in German it's called Zum ewigen Frieden, to eternal peace. He makes a point analogous to what I just made, that we say we're at peace, like as states say we're at peace. We're not at war. But there's some different between that and what we might call absolute peace. There are two different meanings at play. There's effective peace, just the status quo. But there's an important difference to what we might dream about in terms of peace. And Kant argues that's an important dialectic to keep alive. It's like Martin Luther King's thing about the two kinds of time. It's really integral to our politics, our sense of justice, our communication of a certain fantasy beyond what is actually achieved. History is about our capacity for total radical change. Culture grows precisely because of its unpredictability, because of our freedom from causal determination. So the scenario here, again, we were just talking about violence and terrors, saying, so what happens? There's chaos breaks out. People are running through the street. You think you see somebody pull out a gun. You have a gun. Like, what makes you decide to pull the trigger or not? How does that decision get made? So he explores that.
We start. What was going on in your brain 1 second before you pulled that trigger? And this brings us into the realm of a brain region called the amygdala. The amygdala, which is central to violence, central to fear, initiates volleys of cascades that produce pulling of a trigger. What was the level of activity in your amygdala 1 second before? But to understand that, we have to step back a little bit. What was going on in the environment seconds to minutes before that impacted the amygdala? Now, obviously, the sights, the sounds of the rioting, that was pertinent. But in addition, you're more likely to mistake a cell phone for a handgun if that stranger was male and large and of a different race. Furthermore, if you're in pain, if you're hungry, if you're exhausted, your frontal cortex is not going to work as well. Part of the brain whose job it is to get to the amygdala in time saying, are you really sure that's a gun there? But we need to step further back. Now we have to look at hours to days before. And with this, we have entered the realm of hormones. For example, testosterone, where regardless of your sex, if you have elevated testosterone levels in your blood, you're more likely to think a face with a neutral expression is instead looking threatening. Elevated testosterone levels, elevated levels of stress hormones, and your amygdala is going to be more active and your frontal cortex will be more sluggish. Pushing back further, weeks to months before, where's the relevance there? This is the realm of neural plasticity, the fact that your brain can change in response to experience. And if your previous months have been filled with stress and trauma, your amygdala will have enlarged. The neurons will have become more excitable. Your frontal cortex would have atrophied, all relevant to what happens in that 1 second. But we push back even more, back years, back, for example, to your adolescence. Now, the central fact of the adolescent brain is all of it is going full blast except the frontal cortex, which is still half-baked. It doesn't fully mature until you're around 25. And thus, adolescence and early adulthood are the years where environment and experience sculpt your frontal cortex into the version you're going to have as an adult in that critical moment. But pushing back even further back to childhood and fetal life and all the different versions that could come in. Now, obviously, that's the time that your brain is being constructed, and that's important. But in addition, experience during those times produce what are called epigenetic changes. Permanent, in some cases, permanently activating certain genes, turning off others. And as an example of this, if as a fetus you were exposed to a lot of stress hormones from your mother, epigenetics is going to produce your amygdala in adulthood as a more excitable form, and you're going to have elevated stress hormone levels. But pushing even further back to when you were just a fetus, back to when all you were a collection of genes. Now, genes are really important to all of this, but critically, genes don't determine anything because genes work differently in different environments. Key example here, there's a variant of a gene called MAO alpha. And if you have that variant, you are far more likely to commit antisocial violence. If and only if you were abused as a child. Genes and environment interact, and what's happening in that 1 second before you pull that trigger reflects your lifetime of those gene-environment interactions. Now, remarkably enough, we've got to push even further back now, back centuries. What were your ancestors up to? And if, for example, they were nomadic pastoralists, people living in the deserts or grasslands with their herds of camels, cows, goats, odds are they would have invented what's called a culture of honor, filled with warrior classes, retributive violence, clan vendettas, and amazingly, centuries later, that would still be influencing the values with which you were raised. But we've got to push even further back millions of years. Because if we're talking about genes, implicitly, we're now talking about the evolution of genes. And what you see is, for example, patterns across different primate species. Some of them have evolved for extremely low levels of aggression. Others have evolved in the opposite direction. And floating there in between by every measure are humans. Once again, this confused, barely defined species that has all these potentials to go one way or the other. So what has this gotten us to? Basically, what we're seeing here is if you want to understand a behavior, whether it's an appalling one, a wondrous one, or confusedly in between, if you want to understand that, you've got to take into account what happened a second before to a million years before, everything in between. So what can we conclude at this point? Officially, it's complicated. Wow, that's really helpful. It's complicated, and you better be real careful, real cautious before you conclude you know what causes a behavior, especially if it's a behavior you're judging harshly. Now, to me, the single most important point about all of this is one having to do with change. Every bit of biology I have mentioned here can change in different circumstances. For example, ecosystems change. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was a lush grassland. Cultures change. In the 17th century, the most terrifying people in Europe were the Swedes, rampaging all over the place. This is what the Swedish military does now. They haven't had a war in 200 years. Most importantly, brains change. Neurons grow new processes, circuits disconnect, everything in the brain changes, and out of this come extraordinary examples of human change. First one. This is a man named John Newton, a British theologian who played a central role in the abolition of slavery from the British Empire in the early 1800s. And amazingly, this man spent decades as a younger man as the captain of a slave ship, and then as an investor in slavery, growing rich from this. And then something changed. Something changed in him, something that Newton himself celebrated in the thing that he's most famous for, a hymn that he wrote, Amazing Grace. This is a man named Zenji Abe on the morning of December 6th, 1941, about to lead a squadron of Japanese bombers to attack Pearl Harbor. And this is the same man 50 years later to the day hugging a man who survived the attack on the ground. And as an old man, Zenji Abe came to a collection of Pearl Harbor survivors at a ceremony there and in halting English apologized for what he had done as a young man. Now, it doesn't always require decades. Sometimes extraordinary change could happen in just hours. Consider the World War I Christmas truce of 1914. Powers that be had negotiated a brief truce so that soldiers could go out, collect bodies from no man's land in between the trench lines. And soon, British and German soldiers were doing that, and then helping each other carry bodies, and then helping each other dig graves in the frozen ground, and then praying together, and then having Christmas together and exchanging gifts. And by the next day, they were playing soccer together and exchanging addresses so they could meet after the war. That truce kept going until the officers had to arrive and said, we will shoot you unless you go back to trying to kill each other. And all it took here was hours for these men to develop a completely new category of us. All of us in the trenches here on both sides dying for no damn reason, and who was a them, those faceless powers behind the lines who were using them as pawns. And sometimes change can occur in seconds. Probably the most horrifying event in the Vietnam War was the My Lai massacre. A brigade of American soldiers went into an undefended village full of civilians and killed between 350 and 500 of them. Mass raped women and children, mutilated bodies. It was appalling. It was appalling because it occurred, because the government denied it, because the US government eventually did nothing more than a slap on the wrist, and appalling because it almost certainly was not a singular event. This man, Hugh Thompson, this is the man who stopped the My Lai massacre. He was piloting a helicopter gunship, landed there, got out, and saw American soldiers shooting babies, shooting old women, figured out what was going on, and he then took his helicopter and did something that undid his lifetime of conditioning as to who was an us and who was a them. He landed his helicopter in between some surviving villagers and American soldiers, and he trained his machine guns on his fellow Americans and said, if you don't stop the killing, I will mow you down. Now, these people are no more special than any of us. Same neurons, same neurochemicals, same biology. What we're left with here is this inevitable cliche, those who don't study history are destined to repeat it. What we have here is the opposite of it. Those who don't study the history of extraordinary human change, those who don't study the biology of what can transform us from our worst to our best behaviors, those who don't do this are destined not to be able to repeat these incandescent, magnificent moments. So thank you.
My favorite book to teach is Frankenstein. You know, it's a story of engineering a person. And it's also, you know, about racism and especially sexism. It's really a book about patriarchy. But it's best known as a book about the power of science and technology to engineer personhood. And what I, always think about in relationship to that book is, um, what if Mary Shelley, the author, could wake up today and see her readership, see us? What would she think of us? We would look like freaks of technology to her. Our life expectancy, all just what modern medicine has changed our normal sense of it, of life, what normal human life is. Um, you know, Let alone all the other ways in which has COVID's revealed, like um, technology, the economy, race, have woven their way into our biology, and uh, impacted our bodies. Frankenstein is such an absolute master text of the modern world because it shows how thoroughly questions of culture like racism and patriarchy are enmeshed, inextricable from questions of technology and biology. Technologies of biology and technologies of communication amount to the same thing because communication, as I've been suggesting about metaphor, is always on some level communication about the body. The body is a word and it is an experience, or it's something that you feel and that happens irreducibly, uniquely in every second, and something we're always trying to chase after in our various technologies of communication as well as technologies of medicine and biology and so forth. Another incredible feature of the novel Frankenstein is that its relevance just seems to increase with time. The novel seems to speak to each new generation in new ways and somehow even more penetrating ways over time. It's eminently adaptable. Frankenstein is seminal for technologies that couldn't have been conceivable to Mary Shelley. Cinema, video games. But as I mentioned, the critical focus is not technology so much as patriarchy. And it's a symptom of the problem which Shelley's novel addresses. The character of the monster in the novel is confused with the character of Frankenstein. We tend to identify the monster according to the name of his father. This is symptomatic of both patriarchy and racism, right? Frankenstein, the novel, is about the experience of a body that's created by ideologies that demonize it. That discrepancy between the body we feel, the body we experience, on the one hand, and the body we name and understand, on the other hand, is something we all experience, which is to say that we all experience a kind of monstrosity in ourselves insofar as that gap, that discrepancy, is absolute. That's what I was saying last time about how we're all minorities in an absolute way, even if that discrepancy is not equally costly, it's equally absolute. And Mary Shelley's novel is less a novel than a novel about novels, a novel about how we construct these narratives of family. Frankenstein is composed of embedded narratives. So it begins with this explorer, Walton, who runs into Victor Frankenstein, tells the story of this encounter, and within this story, Victor begins telling his story. of creating the monster. And then within Victor's story, we get the monster's story. And this includes encountering this family of the DeLacy's, this hut in the mountains. Then we hear the story of the DeLacy's family. Within this, we hear the story of Saifi, the daughter of a Christian Arab woman who was confined to live in a harem, but who instilled in her daughter Saifi dreams of a free life in Europe. So all these embedded narratives are addressed to Walton's sister, Margaret, who thereby has the function of a surrogate reader. We are placed in the position of Margaret as readers of Frankenstein. So a really remarkable feature of this setup is that the reader is gendered female, whereas the interlaced stories we read are by men. But for the smallest kernel, which is really silenced. We don't really hear any actual words from Saifi's mother. We just hear of her dream for her daughter. And this dream is in a way nothing more than a principle of maternity, a principle of hope for the life of the next generation. So while it seems at first glance that Frankenstein is about this new modern possibility of technologically engineering a person, in the context of these multiple embedded narratives, we see that this story about technological reproduction is really just a part of the age-old story of patriarchy. But by giving her novel this really elaborate interlaced form, Mary Shelley isn't just making this critique of patriarchy by putting readers in the position of the female reader of this legacy of patriarchal narratives. She's really asking us what we're going to do about it. Like, how are we going to read this? Are we going to be just another layer in this legacy, passively propagating this formula? Or are we going to, again, bear witness to this dream of Saifi's mother, of a woman's free life, which is to say the possibility of a new body, a new possibility for embodiment, which is the question posed by the monster as well. So the question of how we read is a question of how we read bodies, what we make of embodiment. This distinction between possessive individuality, defining oneself in terms of what one owns, versus social communication, defining oneself in terms of an expressive community, a community of imagination and mutual recognition, is really well captured by this famous poem by Percy Shelley, the husband of Mary Shelley. This is a poem about a traveler who returns from an antique land, having seen the ruins of a statue of a great king. On the one hand, the traveler reports the legend at the base of the statue, claim to ownership and mastery. And on the other hand, the traveler reports the artistic insight of the sculptor and the fragments of the ruin of artistic insight into human passion. And this is all juxtaposed to the final image of the kind of endless frontier. It's like the sands of time, final fate of everyone, death. But it's also about what survives. A dream is that's what survives of us, is the way we live on in each other's imaginations and desires.
Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
What's interesting is what the poem explicitly refers to in terms of survival. Its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive. So again, what I want you to think about is how passion, identity, what it means to live a purposeful life, have or exercise meaningful life is a fantasy that we share and that we update, we bounce back and forth to one another. Drew up a little diagram that I think explains the form of communication in this poem. If you think of the different speakers in the poem, it begins with the I, then that quickly gives way to this traveler who is quoted. The traveler then sees the passions that the sculptor read. We see the reading of passion by the sculptor. This is juxtaposed to the words of Ozymandias, and these give way to the voice of time that eventually destroy these, but not the reading of the sculptor. And a cool feature of this poem is that it's asymmetrical. The I introduces this long quotation from the traveler, but the I doesn't return. It's like, why is it even there? If isn't going to conclude the story somehow. It's enough to like leave a sense of hollowness, like there's an absence here, or a silence that echoes the lone and level sands stretching far away. I think it echoes the unspeakability of death. You know, it's like of that long time, eternity. What can be said of that? The force that wrecks the King of Kings. But we can bear witness to it. Like that echo, feeling that echo is a kind of witness bearing that gets communicated. It's what the Romantics called sublime, ineffable. But it's getting communicated rather than suppressed. And it leaves that empty space to the reader. We're left to bear witness to it in our own way. So hence the sort of exchangeability here. I, you, writer, reader are put in the same level position. There's a leveling effect, whereas Ozymandias speaks down to tells his audience to despair. The author here puts the reader on the same level. In the face of the eternity, the lone and level sands, we're all on the same level. What's significant, I think, about this circular arrangement that comes back, to the exchangeability of the artist and audience, I and you, it doesn't need to exploit. It doesn't need to exploit other people. It doesn't need to exploit the earth. The way Ozymandias' story, I'm the master, and in order to prove my mastery, I have this statue, I own all this stuff, I'm making all these people despair. It's kind of a linear narrative that has a certain endpoint and it achieves a kind of conclusiveness. This is a dream that's just kept in the air by the act of transmitting it, bearing witness, communicating.